All right, today we're diving into some pretty deep philosophical waters, the concept of reference.
Mhm.
And we've got a whole stack of dense texts here, all trying to figure out just how our words latch onto things in the real world.
Yeah, it's one of those things, we do it every day without even thinking, but explaining how it works, well, that's a whole different story.
Totally. Like, I could say Mount Everest, and you instantly picture it, right?
Mm.
But the mechanism behind that connection, how that actually happens, is surprisingly complex.
And that's where the philosophy of language comes in, right? So today, we're zeroing in on linguistic reference specifically, how words themselves pull off this referring act.
Right, because not all words do that. I mean, but or the,
Hmm.
they don't seem to point to any one thing, right? We're more interested in the words that have like a target, a specific thing they aim for, the ones philosophers call singular referential terms.
Yeah, think of them like the words with laser focus. So proper names like Barack Obama, pronouns like he or she, definite descriptions like the tallest mountain in the world, those kinds of things.
And the big question we're tackling today is, do all these different types of words refer in the same way? Because there are a bunch of competing theories out there, each with their own kind of pluses and minuses.
Yeah, and to make sense of it all, the text we're working with walks us through these different types of words one by one. So I guess the natural place to start is with what you might call the superstars of reference, proper names.
Yeah, at first glance, they do seem the most straightforward, right? Plato, London, the Mona Lisa, bam, you know exactly what we're talking about. But trust me, there's a whole philosophical rabbit hole to go down here.
Because it all starts to get fuzzy when you ask, why does that particular string of sounds pick out that particular thing in the world? Is it just because we, collectively decided to use it that way?
And that's where the descriptivist theories come in, right?
Yeah.
That camp says that a name is basically a shortcut for a description, a mental tag we attach to something to pick out the referent.
Right, you can think of it like having a little mental file folder for each name, right? So for David Cameron, one person might have a folder packed with details about his political career, but their neighbor might just have guy who lives across the street filed away. Different descriptions, same referent.
So basically, we're all carrying around these mental files for every name we know. Seems a little messy, but I guess it could work.
Well, it does have some appeal. For one, it could explain how we understand sentences even with fictional names. Sherlock Holmes lived at 221B Baker Street. We get that, even though there's no real Sherlock, right? The description gives us enough to work with.
But hold on, didn't some philosopher come along and just totally poke holes in this whole names or descriptions idea?
Ah, you're talking about Saul Kripke, one of the heavy hitters in the philosophy of language. He came up with some pretty devastating arguments against that descriptivist view.
Okay, yeah, remind me, what were those arguments again?
So one of his most famous is the what we call the might problem. Take a sentence like, David Cameron might not have called for a Brexit referendum. Makes perfect sense, right? But if we replace his name with that whole description, a descriptivist would use.
Okay, let me try. The UK Prime Minister, who called for the Brexit referendum, might not have called for the Brexit referendum. Yeah, this is just a tangled mess.
Exactly, it becomes a contradiction. Kripke's point was, names can fit into these modal contexts, talking about possibilities in a way descriptions just can't.
So that's strike one against the descriptivists.
Yeah.
What else did Kripke have in his arsenal?
He also pointed out what we call the Feynman problem. We can use names even when we know very little about the person. Like if someone says Feynman was a genius, I might get who they're talking about even if all I know is he was some physicist, right?
But you're not referring to just any physicist,
Yeah.
right? So your mental description is way too vague to be picking out Feynman specifically.
Exactly, and that suggests that our grip on a name isn't just based on some bunch of descriptions. Something more direct is going on.
Okay, so descriptivism is starting to look a little shaky. What's the alternative then?
Well, the other major camp is called Millianism, after the philosopher John Stuart Mill, and they go in the complete opposite direction, claiming that names are basically just labels stuck directly onto things.
So no descriptions needed at all, just a straight-up connection between a name and the object.
Right. The meaning of the name is the referent itself for a million. And this view has a certain elegance to it, especially when you think about identity statements.
It's like Hesperus is phosphorus. That's just a fancy way of saying Venus is Venus, right?
Exactly. If names are just labels for the same thing, those statements become super simple, trivially true, but of course there's a catch.
I figured as much. If it's just a label, how does the right thing get labeled in the first place? Like, how did that specific combo of sounds, Feynman, get attached to that particular physicist?
That's where what we call the causal theory of names comes in, trying to ground this whole labeling process in an initial act of dubbing. Imagine, way back when, someone points at Venus in the evening sky and says, "You're called Hesperus."
Like a christening for an object. And from that point on, the name gets passed down through like generations of language users.
Exactly. So when you say Hesperus today, you're tapping into that original act of naming, even if you weren't there yourself.
That's kind of mind-blowing when you think about it. But doesn't this get messy when you start reusing names?
Hmm?
Like, I could call my pet turtle Napoleon, and we wouldn't confuse him with the emperor, right?
Good point. The causal theory says that's fine because our intentions matter. When you say Napoleon went for a swim in his bowl, you're clearly not talking about the French emperor, right?
So there is a mental component to it, after all, even for the millions. But this whole multiple bearers thing throws a wrench into both camps, doesn't it?
For sure. It raises some tough questions about how we pick out which Napoleon is being talked about, especially when the context isn't clear. Seems like descriptions and causal chains might both fall short in some cases.
Right, so both theories have their pros and cons. It's a real philosophical tug of war. But before we declare a stalemate, there's another type of referential term that throws a whole new set of challenges into the mix. Indexicals.
So indexicals, right. What makes these guys so interesting is they're totally context dependent. Their meaning changes depending on who's saying them and when. Like, I means something different coming from you than from me. Here, changes with location. Now is always moving forward.
They're like, I don't know, linguistic chameleons or something, always adapting to the situation. So how do we even analyze them in terms of reference? Do they even have fixed meanings at all?
Good question. And philosophers have noticed they don't all act the same way either. We can split them up, between what we call pure indexicals. Those are super tightly bound to the context, specific features, and then there's impure ones where it gets a bit messier.
Give me an example of each, because my head's already starting to spin a bit here.
Sure. So the classic pure indexicals, the ones everyone thinks of first, are I, here, and now. Simple, right? I always means the speaker no matter who it is. Here, the location of the utterance. Now, the time it's said. Pretty straightforward, yeah.
Okay, I see how those are like really stuck to the context. But how do they actually refer to anything? Are we back to playing the description game again?
Some folks thought so. Frege, Russell, those big names. They tried to apply that same descriptivist model we talked about with names to indexicals too. So I would mean something like the speaker of this utterance and so on.
But wouldn't that run into those same problems Kripke brought up? Like if I'm thinking about, I don't know, Beyonce, that doesn't suddenly make me Beyonce, even if I'm associating that description with I in my head.
You got it. That's one issue. Another is it makes it sound like every time someone says, "I'm hungry," it's the exact same statement. But clearly, you saying that is different from me saying it, right? Different I's we're referring to.
So descriptions alone, not quite cutting it for indexicals then. Any better way to explain how they work?
There is. David Kaplan, the same guy who did a lot of work on names, came up with a really neat solution for pure indexicals. Called it the character model of reference.
Okay, now you've got me interested.
Yeah.
Break it down for me. What's this character all about?
So Kaplan said we got to keep two things separate, character and content. Content is what we've been talking about so far, what the word actually means in that specific context, what it contributes to the sentence.
So content is like what it ends up referring to in that moment. What about this character then?
Character is more like the rule, the underlying function that tells you how to get the content in any context.
Like the recipe rather than the specific dish you end up with.
Nailed it. Perfect analogy. For pure indexicals, this character is a simple rule. I always means return the speaker, whoever that happens to be. So the content changes depending on who's talking, but the underlying rule stays put.
Ah, makes sense. That avoids that problem of me becoming Beyonce just by thinking about her.
Yeah.
Because the rule is just about the speaker role, not about specific descriptions I have.
Exactly. And it also explains why your "I'm hungry" and my "I'm hungry" are different claims, even though we're using the same word. Same rule, but different content because the context who's speaking has changed.
Okay, starting to see the beauty of this character model.
Yeah.
But we said not all indexicals are so well behaved, right? What about the impure ones? The ones where the connection to the context isn't so obvious.
Now we're getting into the real tricky stuff. Impure indexicals, things like he, she, this, that. They don't have those nice, neat connections to speaker time or place that the pure ones do.
Yeah, it feels like their reference depends way more on like the whole situation, what we're looking at, what we're talking about, that kind of stuff.
You got it. One idea is we rely a lot on what we call ostensive gestures, pointing, basically. If I say this while pointing at a cat, pretty clear what this refers to, right?
Sure, but we don't always point when using these words.
Mm,
And even if we do, pointing can be vague, right?
right.
What if I just kind of gesture towards a bunch of objects? Which one does this pick out then?
You're hitting on a big limitation of relying only on gestures. Seems like we need some other factors to explain how these impure indexicals actually manage to refer.
So what are the other contenders in this philosophical battle royale?
Well, one big view is that speaker intention plays a huge role. And this is where Kaplan comes back into the picture, arguing that for demonstratives like this and that, the speaker's intention is actually part of the character of the word itself.
Hold on, so now we're back to relying on what's happening in the speaker's mind. Doesn't that just lead us right back to the Humpty Dumpty problem? Can't I just intend that to refer to anything I want, even if it makes zero sense to anyone else?
Yeah, that's a valid worry. And even Kaplan knew it was a challenge. He tried to limit the power of intention, restricting his view to perceptual cases. If I'm pointing right at something I can see, my intention should be clear enough.
But what about when we're talking about stuff we can't see, like he left earlier, talking about someone who's gone? Or think about that, it'll blow your mind, where that could be some abstract idea.
Those are tricky, no doubt, and they've led to some interesting attempts to, refine this intentionalist approach. Some folks, like Gail Stein, brought in ideas from Paul Grice, who argued that communicative intentions have to be something the listener can actually figure out.
So it's not just my private intention, it's got to be something you, the listener, can pick up on and use to understand what I'm getting at.
Right on. My intention has to be recognizable, something you can use to work out what I'm referring to. But even that might not be enough to dodge all those potential Humpty Dumpty style pitfalls.
So are there other ways to like rein in this power of intention and make sure language doesn't just fall apart into chaos?
Well, some philosophers have suggested that the words themselves might put limits on what we can intend them to refer to. Like maybe this and that, by their very nature, have to be used for something roughly in the direction of the speaker's gesture, even if their inner intention is on something else entirely.
Like there are limits built into the language itself, regardless of what's going on in our heads.
That's the idea. And then there are approaches that kind of shift the focus away from individual intentions altogether and look more at the dynamics of the conversation itself.
Intriguing. Tell me more about how that works.
So the idea here is that what's being referred to, especially with pronouns like he or she, is determined by what's at the center of attention in the discourse, what we're focused on in that moment.
So less about isolated intentions and more about how we build this shared understanding of what we're talking about as the conversation unfolds.
Exactly. This highlights how much reference is tied up with the whole flow of communication and context. It might not be just words pointing at things, but how we use words to successfully direct each other's attention.
Okay, so we've tackled names, wrestled with these slippery indexicals, but there's one more big player in the world of referential terms we need to confront, right?
Yep, and that, my friend, is the realm of definite descriptions. Buckle up, because these phrases bring a whole new set of puzzles to the table.
All right, definite descriptions. Things like the biscuit, the philosopher listening to this. They seem pretty simple, but do they actually refer the same way names or indexicals do?
That, my friend, is the question that's kept philosophers up at night. It sparks some serious debate in the philosophy of language.
Well, they sure seem like they're picking out specific things. I mean, if I say pass the biscuit and there's just one biscuit on the table, you know exactly what I'm talking about, right?
Right, on the surface, it seems totally obvious. But philosophers, we like to dig a little deeper. Ask, what's really going on under the hood, when we use these phrases?
Because sometimes there isn't a biscuit on the table or a philosopher listening. Things can get a little tricky.
Exactly. Think about that classic example, the present king of France is bald. Well, there is no king of France, right? So what is that sentence even about? Is it referring to anything at all?
Yeah, that's a real head scratcher. If it's not referring, does the sentence just become, like, meaningless?
That's where Bertrand Russell enters the picture with his famous theory of descriptions. He argued that definite descriptions don't actually refer in the way we might think. Instead, they're kind of like shorthand for longer, more complex claims.
So instead of pointing to some non-existent king, the sentence is actually saying something about the world, making a statement.
Exactly. Russell would say, the present king of France is bald, is really saying something like, there is one and only one king of France, and that king is bald.
Okay, I see where he's going with that. Since the first part of that statement is false, no unique king of France. The whole thing is false, but at least it's still meaningful.
Right. It makes a claim that we can judge as true or false. But, like most things in philosophy, Russell's view has its share of critics.
It does feel a little counterintuitive, like when I say pass the biscuit,
Right.
I really am talking about that biscuit, not making some grand statement about existence.
That's the pushback. P.F. Strawson, another big name in this field, argued that there are genuinely referential uses of definite descriptions. He said it all boils down to the context, the circumstances.
So sometimes they work like Russell said, talking about existence and uniqueness, and sometimes they really do just pick out a specific thing.
That's the gist. Strawson was focused on how language is actually used in real situations. He said the meaning of a definite description includes this potential for reference, but whether it actually refers depends on if those right conditions are met.
So if there is a biscuit on the table, and just one, then the biscuit can refer directly to it. But if not, the sentence might be doing something else, like Russell suggested.
Precisely. But then things get even wilder when we bring intention back into the picture.
Uh-oh, here we go again. I have a feeling we're heading right back into Humpty Dumpty land.
You're not wrong. Keith Donnellan, another big name in this debate, he claimed we can even refer with a description that's totally false as long as we've got the right thing in mind, so to speak.
Wait, seriously? That sounds like it could lead to all sorts of linguistic chaos. Give me an example.
Okay, picture this. You're at a party, you see a guy holding a drink. You say to your friend, the man with the martini is looking for you. But it turns out he's not actually drinking a martini, it's just water.
So the description is wrong, but I still understand who you mean because you had that specific guy in mind when you said it.
Exactly. Donnellan argued that what the speaker intends can sometimes override the actual truth of the description when it comes to reference. But of course, this raises the question of how much power we want to give intention.
Because if I could just intend any description to refer to anything I want, then language starts to, lose its connection to reality, right?
Right, and Donnellan, like others before him, tried to deal with this worry by using Grice's ideas about communicative intentions. The thought is, my intention has to be something you, the listener, can reasonably figure out from the context.
So it's not just my own little private intention. It has to be something you can grasp to understand what I'm trying to refer to.
Exactly. But even with that Gratian constraint, the role of intention in reference is still a pretty hot topic. Lots of debate still going on.
So where does all this leave us with these slippery, definite descriptions? No easy answer to whether they refer or how they do it.
It's true. And to make things even more complex, Kripke suggested that maybe it's all just pragmatics, how we use language in real situations to get our point across, rather than some deep, inherent connection between words and things.
So with descriptions, maybe we often just have a particular thing in mind and the listener figures it out based on the situation, our shared knowledge, that kind of stuff. But there's no guarantee that the description itself is actually picking out that thing in some strict philosophical sense.
That's one way to think about it. And it brings us back to a theme we've seen throughout this whole deep dive. The interplay of intention, context, linguistic conventions, all that, in the act of referring. It's not just words pointing to things, it's how we use language to navigate our shared reality.
Man, it's been quite a journey through the philosophy of reference. We've grappled with names, tangled with indexicals, and now wrestled with these elusive, definite descriptions. Seems like every step of the way, new puzzles and complexities pop up.
It's true. And I think the big takeaway is there's no one single agreed upon model of how reference works. All the theories we've talked about, descriptivism, millionism, character theories, intentionalist accounts, they all have their strong points and their weaknesses.
So what are our listeners, our fellow philosophy fans, what are they supposed to make of all this?
Well, hopefully it makes them realize how much we take for granted when we use language to talk about the world. Even something as basic as naming a thing, turns out it raises a whole bunch of philosophical questions and debates.
And maybe a healthy dose of skepticism too, right? Anyone claiming to have all the answers, probably not the whole story. Reference is messy, it's fascinating, and it's something that's going to keep philosophers thinking, and hopefully our listeners thinking, for a long time to come.
Absolutely. But here's a final thought to chew on. If reference is something we actively do with language, this collaborative act between speaker and listener, how much can we really mess with it? Where's the line between clever use and full-on Humpty Dumpty word bending? Something to ponder as you continue your own linguistic adventures out there.
And with that, we'll wrap up our deep dive into the world of reference. Thanks for sticking with us, and we hope you'll join us next time as we explore some other fascinating corner of the philosophical world.